Hi, folks. Today we are going to continue with what we have already started with some time earlier. That is, along with those two basic questions, what is literary criticism and what is literary theory? Today we are going to devote our attention to another question, which is as important as those earlier, that is, what is literature? For those who are interested in the topic, I may refer them to two books. One, Theory of Literature by the famous American critic and theorist by the name of Rainier Malik, which was published in 1947. And there is another book by the same title, What is Literature, by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. But as usual, we are going to deal with what is available in front of us. That is the book which is assigned for you as students in the fourth year. So let us look at page 12, right in the middle. What is literature? You are going to recognize definitely that there are two types of definitions. One is called broad definition of literature, and the second one is narrow. We are going to be concerned with these two. Some assume that literature is simply anything that is written, thereby declaring a city telephone directory, a cookbook, and a road atlas to be literary works, along with the Pride and Prejudice and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This is a broad definition, or rather very general definition, and you can recognize that it confuses between what is literature and what is non-literature. To help us understand what is meant by literature, he likewise goes to look at the etymology of the word literature. And we have already come across the word etymology, that is to say, the science that studies the development and the evolution and development of a lexical item or a word. He says, by the way, Pride and Prejudice is a very famous novel written by Jane Austen. I'm quite confident that you might have come across the title at least. And Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is an American novel by the famous American writer Mark Twain, derived from the Latin litera. So now the origin of the word literature is from Latin. So it is, in other words, a Latinate origin. It is of a Latinate origin. Latinate is an adjective derived from the word Latin, derived from the Latin litera, meaning letter. The root meaning of the word literature refers primarily to the written word and seems to support this broad definition. So now we are dealing with the first type of definition, which could be categorically labeled as a broad definition. Yet such a definition eliminates the important oral traditions upon which much of our literature is based, including Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So what is missing in this definition is that it excludes an important category, which is oral literature, ما يسمى بالأدب الشفاهي. نحن كعرب ثقافتنا شفاهية. نحن نتاج لما يسمى بثقافة العنعنة، عن وما إلى ذلك. By the way, there is a famous linguist by the name of Leibov who has developed a mechanism with the help of which you can analyze an oral story. And this is not the place that I'm going to go in detail as far as, there's a schematization of the oral story. This is for your own general knowledge if you are interested. And this is the problem with this kind of lectures. The English epic Beowulf and many American legends, among many other examples. So what is missing in the broad definition of what literature is the category of oral literature. To solve this difficulty, the difficulty of confusing these two types of definitions, others choose to define literature as an art, thereby leaving open the question of its being written or oral. So the second definition of what literature is supposed to be is that it is equating literature with art. And you know, when we speak about art, definitely there is a place for imagination and language. Language here is used metaphorically, because when we deal with the plastic art, الفن التشكيلي, we are not dealing with words. So is the case with the cinema. Cinema is also an art, but the basic constituting item is not a word, rather it is the image, or what is called the portrait, or whatever you like to call it. This definition further narrows its meaning, equating literature to works of the imagination or creative writing. We don't have a course under the rubric of creative writing, الكتابة الإبداعية, a course which is meant or highly instrumental in teaching you how to write a short story, a poem, and so on and so forth. In some other universities outside Iraq, there are courses under the title, as I said, of creative writing. To emphasize the imaginative qualities of literature, some critics choose to use the German word for literature, word Kunst, instead of its equivalent, English equivalent, because word Kunst automatically implies that the imaginative and creative aspect of literature are essential components of the word literature. In other words, some critics prefer the German word rather than the English word. Hence, this word excludes the confusion between what is oral or what is written in literature. We go on. Whether this is on page 13, whether one accepts the broad or narrow definition, many argue that a text must have certain peculiar qualities before it can be dubbed. Dubbed means described or called or labeled or categorized as literature. If we go back to the idea that, you know, ever since our school days, primary school days, we have been dealing with pieces of literature. They are so familiar to the point that we hardly question their own nature. Significantly, if somebody tries to have more ideas about nature and function of literature, there is a chapter in the book that I have already referred to under the title Theory of Literature, and it may be the first and the second chapter of this book. Anyhow, those who hold this view believe that an artistic creation or a secondary world often mirrors the author's primary world. So in this regard, we have two types of world. One is called لا يمكن تشخيصها أو الإشارة إليها بالإصبع، وإنما نجد أو نتوصل إلى وجودها من عدم وجودها عبر تأثيراتها أو تجلياتها. Yes. Although I'm quite confident that you have already come across the word structure in your study of grammar, and so is the case true with your transformational course. Surface and deep structure, but hardly is there a definition which has been introduced to you. You have to have a very good idea as to the differences between shape, form, and structure. And again, there is no room for me here to elaborate upon this. Try to check them in the dictionary. And this is your own job as a student. So to achieve this structure, the artist must create a plot. By the way, there is a book under the title Aspects of the Novel by the famous English novelist E.M. Forster. And the British have got their understanding of what a plot is supposed to be. different radically from what the Russian or the French. If the British, represented by Ian Forster, speak about a plot and a story, the Russian between fabula and Suzette, the French between story and discourse. And to speak in detail about these basic terms, it takes us a lot of time. And yes, it might take more than 6 months to speak about them with their applications. But in passing, I am referring you to this. So we have a plot, subplot, superplot, and a plot plus a plot. I'm sure in your study of the novel or fiction, you might have been introduced to these categories. Character. According to Forster, we have got round and flat characters. But according to Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, a famous psychologist who used to be a student of Sigmund Freud, he introduces two basic terms, introvert and extrovert. انبساطي يعني انطوائي وانبساطي. Tone, these are some of the constitutive aspects or elements of what makes literature into literature, ranging from a plot and ending with some other elements which we are going to deal with. You see, laconically, يعني باختصار. Character, tone. I expect or I suspect that you have been introduced to the term tone in your study of phonetics and phonology in the second year. And we've got tonic languages. But here, in literature and criticism, tone is supposed to be understood differently in the sense that tone is the attitude or the attitude to or towards and the positions on, you see, of a writer to his own material. All right. Symbols. Symbols can be defined or categorized into public symbols and private symbols. Okay. And there are so many symbols, famous symbols. You see the cross for the Christianity and the crescent for Muslims. Conflict. This is a very important term, which is supposed to be associated with with the dynamics of literature, dynamics of the story, and so on and so forth. And a host of other elements. Host means group of other elements or parts of the artistic story. With all of these elements working in a dynamic relationship to produce a literary work. Some would argue that it's the creation of these elements, how they are used and in what context, that determines whether a piece of writing is literature. That is to say, on the basis of the availability and non-availability, توفر or عدم توفر, these elements, you see, literature can be made. And how they are used in a certain context. There are so many types of context, intra-textual context, or extra-textual context, and context is a very significant element in determining the meaning or the outlining the situation of what a sentence or a short story means or implies. I don't like to go in detail as far as the word context, simply because I suppose that you have already come across the term in your study of linguistics. By the way, there is a famous linguist by the name of Roman Jakobson. In studying or in analyzing what makes a message, a verbal message, into a message, he introduces the element of context. Right. Because of these elements, a message tends to be meaningful. Right. Still, all other critics add the test of time criteria. So it's not only those elements that we have already covered. Some critics add another element, the test of time. يعني اختبار الزمن. من العمل الأدبي الذي بمقدوره أن يتجاوز اختبار الزمن يمكن أن يكون أو يوصف من عيون الأدب. That's to say, the masterpieces of literature. And he is going to give us a famous example. Test of time criterion to their essential components of literature. If a work such as Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante, this is a very famous Italian writer. He is famous for the Divine Comedy and another book by the title of La Vita Nueva, يعني الحياة جديدة بالعربية. And there are certain ideas that have been put forward by some people who are interested in comparative literature, whereby they say that, you know, the Divine Comedy is very much influenced by رسالة الغفران لأبي العلاء المعري. Again, I wouldn't suppose, or I wouldn't believe that any one of you might have touched even رسالة الغفران للمعري. But this is the nature of things. Things are linked, right? With this stands the passage of time and is still being read centuries after its creation. It is deemed valuable and worthy to be called literature because it has survived the test of time. It is still translated into so many languages and taught in highly esteemed universities. Highly esteemed universities, the Divine Comedy. للمعلومات أن هناك رجل مصري اسمه مصطفى عثمان كرس كل جهوده وحياته لترجمة الكوميديا الإلهية للعربية. فالمهتمون ممكن أن يراجعوا ترجمة حسن عثمان. And this is quite rare among you, I suppose, because if this one has traveled to Italy, to the very place you see where Dante used to live, fishing for new material and thumbing through, يعني يتصفح, thumb through the documents that have been left by Dante Alighieri. This criteria also denotes literature functional cultural value. If people value a written work for whatever reason, they often declare it to be literature, whether or not it contains the prescribed elements of a text. Some people, or quite often people who are culturally oriented, can bestow a certain value or significance on certain works, and thus they tend to be written or literary works. The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, يعني بروز وسقوط الإمبراطورية الرومانية، كان في الأساس كتابا في التاريخ، لكنه بمرور الزمن أصبح كتابا أدبيا لأن الناس خلعوا عليه هذه القيمة. Often declare it to be literature whether or not it contains the prescribed elements of a text. We continue. What this work may contain is a peculiar aesthetic quality. What makes it a piece of literature is that it carries a certain peculiar aesthetic quality. يعني سمة جمالية معينة. Unfortunately, we don't have a course in aesthetics, علم الجمال. That is to say, a science which helps us to define what is beautiful and what is ugly, what makes the beautiful beautiful. It's not a matter of impression, but there are certain categories, principles, and moments, aesthetic moments, ما يسمى باللحظات الجمالية، وهذا نعثر عليه في كتاب نقد الحكم للفيلسوف الألماني إيمانويل كانت. And you can recognize where you stand right now. Okay, that is some elements of beauty that distinguishes it as literature from other forms of writing. Aesthetics is going to define what is meant by aesthetics. The calamity or the catastrophe is that we quite often, this is our job, we deal with so many aspects of beauty, but we don't have a course in aesthetics. Okay, aesthetics, the branch of philosophy. Again, aesthetics is missing as well as philosophy, and this is what we are going through, the branch of philosophy that deals with the concept of the beautiful. strives to determine the criteria for beauty in a work of art. That is to say, it defines, it determines, it classifies, you see, those beautiful aspects that are innate, كامنة محايثة. By the way, innateness is one of the basic linguistic ideas that I suppose you are going to go through or to come across when you study transformational English generative grammar. Okay, innateness. And after all, innateness is not purely Chomsky's, rather it is Platonic. يعني هذه الفكرة في أساسها ترجع إلى الفيلسوف اليوناني أفلاطون. Anyhow, to determine the criteria for beauty in a work of art, theorists such as Plato, I don't know whether you have read something on or about Plato, and Aristotle declares that the source of beauty is inherent within the art object itself. That is to say, the beauty of a literary work is available within the work itself, rather than being outside the work. Other critics declares that the source of beauty is inherent, that's to say within. Well, يعني كامن ثاوي, the art object itself. Other critics, such as David Hume. David Hume is a very famous British philosopher, famous for his book, An Essay on Human Understanding. And to his own credit, there is a doctrine in philosophy, هناك مبدأ أو مذهب في الفلسفة labeled as skepticism, الشكوكية. So skepticism of David Hume maintains that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What determines what the beauty is lies in the individual himself or herself and how he looks at something. It is in the eye of the beholder, the one who sees. And some contemporary theorists argue that one's perception of beauty in a text rests in the dynamic relationship between the object, the text, and the perceiver, the reader, at a given moment in time. These ideas have evolved or thrived in what is called, quite, I would say, rather recently, into what is labeled reader response theory, the interaction between the text on the one hand and the reader on the other. Wherever the criteria for judging the beauty of a work of art finally resides, most critics agree that a work of literature does have an appealing aesthetic quality. That is to say, it appeals to you. You may relate to a certain character in a novel. As an Iraqi, for example, you may relate to Mrs. Ramsey, as I said, in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, in a way different from some other, you see, literary works or novels. So is the case true? An Englishman may relate in a way differently to the season of migration to the north by طيب صالح. يعني استجابة القارئ الإنجليزي لرواية الطيب صالح السوداني في موسم الهجرة للشمال تختلف ربما أو في كثير من الأحيان عن استجابة القارئ العراقي لهاملت, لورdsworth, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, on page 15, overall, he is going to wrap up. To wrap up means to sum up, to summarize. The definition of literature depends on the particular kind of literary theory or school of criticism that the reader or critic espouses. Espouses means adopts. Okay? يتبنى. For formalists, for example, the text and the text alone contains certain qualities. To speak about the formalists and who they are, we are in need of a special time, and it takes us more than a year if we try to speak in detail about who the formalists are, beginning with the 20s of the 20th century, that is to say, the American New Criticism, and ending up with the post-structuralist. يعني نبتدي مع النقاد ما يعرفوا بالنقاد الأمريكان الجدد وانتهاء بالتفكيكيين, beginning, for example, with Clinic Brooks and ending up with the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. The example, the text and the text alone contains certain qualities that make a particular piece of writing literature. There are certain qualities that are available in a text. If we try to focus our attention on these qualities or in these elements, we are within the field of formalistic criticism. Okay. Why? Because you know their attention is exclusively focused on the formalistic aspects of literary works to the total exclusion, يعني لإقصاء تام, total exclusion of all other extrinsic elements, العناصر الخارجية. And I'm going to talk briefly about the intrinsic and the extrinsic when the time comes, that make a particular piece of writing literature. On the other hand, for reader-oriented critics, by the way, the reader turns out to be a very significant category in the analysis, interpretation of a literary work, beginning with Sydney in the 16th century, which I suppose, again, that you have been introduced in your second year to some poems, some lines by Philip Sidney. Because, you know, this critic has or had written two famous essays, A Defense of Poetry and An Apology of Poetry, whereby you can recognize that he is of the idea that, you know, the reader reinvents or re-imitates what the writer has already imitated. And by the way, I would like to draw the attention to a very significant point as far as reader-oriented critics. Response is understood by the British in a way different from the French and the Americans. The first attempt to gauge, to measure the response of the reader to a certain literary work starts practically in 1929 with a famous English critic by the name of I.A. Richards, whose books have already been translated into Arabic, beginning with the Principles of Literary Criticism, مبادئ النقد الأدبي, Practical Criticism, Poetry and Sciences, and so on and so forth. I don't like to go in detail as far as the books by I.A. Richards and how far influential was he on a group of critics in the States, and that's to say in the United States of America, simply the Kenneth Brooks, Austin Warren, and so on and so forth. And the case is also clear as far as England is concerned. His influence can be recognized very clearly in his students' work, 7 Types of Ambiguity by William Anson. We have already agreed that, you know, to study literary criticism, you should be aware of the idea that one has to have a solid background in philosophy, first of all, and never to be intimidated, لا يرتعب ولا يهاب ولا يخطف, by the so many names that are introduced or referred to. This is the nature of literary criticism, and this problem cannot be resolved only through a wide reading and having a solid background and against which you can develop your own understanding and response to what literary criticism is supposed to be, and the meta language, that's to say the language used in such a discipline. The interaction and the psychological relationship between the text and the reader help determine whether a document should be deemed literary. Again, we are in front of so many psychological situations, problems, paradoxes, and so on and so forth, and yet we don't have a background in psychology, beginning with Freud's psychoanalysis and ending with the psychoanalysis in its recent phase. And this is a problem. Anyhow, a working knowledge of literary theory can help all readers formulate their ever-developing definition of literature. In other words, having a solid background in literary theory, your response, your attitude to literary works will evolve through the phases of your life. أطوار حياتك. and what they believe constitutes a literary work. Now, we are going to move to some sort of a summary or a synopsis, which helps us or helps you understand what the whole chapter is about. And this is the nature of textbooks. طبيعة الكتب المنهجية أن يلجأ المؤلف إلى تلخيص ما تم الحديث عنه في الصفحات السابقة من الفصل. Okay. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the summary can compensate for, or yes, for what has already been elaborated upon in the earlier pages. يعني التلخيص لا يمكن أن يعوض عن الصفحات. Okay? Because there is an element of selection in every summary. And what may be important for you may not be important to someone else. And that's why, you see, you may include something that may be excluded by someone else. Let us have what the chapter deals with. Tersely, laconically, باختصار. This chapter has stressed the importance of literary theory and criticism and its relationship to literature and the interpretative process. Interpretative, from the word interpret, and interpretation. Again, we don't have a course in interpretation. Anyhow, it has also articulated the underlying premises, فرضيات, presuppositions. And this is a very basic term in logic. We are in need, badly in need, to be logical, although we do not have a course in logic. Underlying premises of why a study of literary theory is essential. So let us go through those points. Literary theory assumes that there is no such a thing as innocent reading. You remember we have already referred to the idea that there is no innocent reading, in the sense that everyone or every reader comes up with a different background against which he looks upon, and looks into a literary work. These are phrasal verbs. Try to check them in the dictionary if you have got a problem in telling the difference between each one of them. Because it's not my job to explain, you see, the meaning of lexical items or words. It is your job to look up them through your own dictionary. Try to keep a dictionary beside you whenever you read. Be it whether or not, be it criticism, linguistics, a story, a play, or whatever. With the passage of time, you will have a reliable lexicon, a reading of the text. And again, we have referred to the idea that as long as there is no innocent reading, there is no innocent language. Whether our responses are emotional or spontaneous or well-reasoned, I suppose, and there are so many suppositions, that you have already come across the word spontaneous in your study of romantic poetry, mainly in Wordsworth's definition of poetry. It is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origins in emotions recollected in tranquility. The problem here is that you cannot understand poetry as you are supposed to without having an idea about the theory against which that poem is written, or poetry, the way, poetry's definition. Every poet has got his own definition of what poetry is supposed to be. All such interactions with and about the text are based on underlying factors that causes us to respond to that text in a particular fashion. What elicits these responses, or how a reader makes sense of a text, is at the heart of literary theory. Number two, because our reactions to any text have theoretical bases, all readers must have a literary theory. That's to say, every reader, be be, whether he is a beginning reader or a sophisticated reader, must have some ideas about literary theory. Otherwise, he could not find his own way. Or he might read that certain work just only for wasting time or spending time or whatever. But this is not actually the case. All readers must have literary theory. The methods we use to frame our personal interpretations of any text directly involve us in the process of literary criticism and theory, automatically making us practicing literary critics. That is to say, in dealing with the text, by using certain methods, you are going to evolve as a literary critic. By the way, what are the differences between methods and methodologies? You have to have a very good idea as to the difference between these. And this helps you a lot in your research paper. What's meant by methods and what's meant by methodologies, what differences there are between these two terms. So on the basis of the methods that we are following or we are going to use in dealing with the literary text, definitely our point of view about a certain literary work will be different. Okay. Many readers have a literary theory that is more often than not unconscious. That's to say, it has been built through continuous reading, and it turns out to be unconscious. It is multi-layered basis, متعددة الطبقات, which has been produced through continuous reading. Unfortunately, these days we hardly read. يعني احنا كقراء قليلين نقرأ بس حتى ننجح. Okay. Incomplete, ill-informed, and eclectic. Eclecticism is a defect, a loophole, a drawback in one's understanding of things. eclecticism يعني الانتقائية أو التلفيقية، وبالتالي هذه واحد من عيوب التفكير وعيوب البحوث. He's eclectic. He snatches something here and something from there and so on and so forth, fusing them together and without having a basis. Okay, so try to avoid as much as you can to be eclectic. There is in chemistry, في الكيمياء, we don't have eclecticism, we have got elective. And this is different. This is different. Therefore, readers' interpretation can easily be illogical, unsound, and haphazard. Haphazard means arbitrary, يعني اعتباطية. والاعتباطية مفهوم أساس في نظرية دي سيسير اللغوية. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. I hope you will remember what you have been introduced. You will not remember anything because last year you haven't been serious. A well-defined, logical, and clearly articulated literary theory, consciously or purposely, enables readers to develop their own methods of interpretation, permitting them to order, clarify, and justify their appreciations. تقييمات. Appreciation. There used to be in this very department a lesson called literary appreciation, which is missing now. Yes. Because students like you are often read and they have no idea what they are after. So try to avoid this by having your own methods. By the way, there's a book under the title, How to Read a Book. How to read a book. Try to look for it. Try to fish for it. Because you are claiming and bragging that you are digital. أنتم تدعون وتزعمون أنكم رقميين. Where are you? Okay. And of a text in a consistent and logical manner. Today, many critics use the term literary criticism and literary theory interchangeably. Yes. Interchangeably, one can take the place of other. That is to say, the borderlines, الحدود, are quite fuzzy and jerky between literary criticism and literary theory. Still others use the term literary theory and continental philosophy synonymously. That is to say, as synonyms, okay? Because in linguistics, we have got synonyms, antonyms, and superordinate terms. Superordinate terms, and these terms are very much significant in semantics. Although the semantic boundaries between literary criticism and literary theory and some continental philosophy are a bit blurred, that's to say confused, they are not markedly separated. They are not markedly separated. Literary criticism assumes that literary theory exists and that literary criticism rests on literary theory concepts, ideas, and ever developing principles. Okay. It is the goal of this text. He is going to speak about the book that you are handling. It is the goal of this text to enable readers to make such conscious, informed, and intelligent choices. By the way, choice as a term is significant, not only in literary criticism, but even on the level of life. Your personal life is no more than a ceaseless series of choices, right from the very morning up to the very minute, up to the very moment you lay your head on the pillow. حياتنا هي عبارة عن سلسلة متواترة من الخيارات. So you have to be very attentive and highly careful in making the right choice at the right time. And in doing so, refine our own methods of literary interpretation and more precisely understand their personal and public reactions to text. This is the significance of literary criticism. It helps us understand, study, interpret a literary work, and define what reactions would we expose to a certain literary work. Right. To accomplish this goal, to achieve it, this text will introduce readers to literary theory and criticism, its historical development, how criticism developed, and the various theoretical positions or schools of enable readers to become knowledgeable critics of their own and others' interpretations. So with the help of this book or with the help of this course, it is wished, hoped that you will arrive at a point where you can stand on your own and to speak your own mind clearly and loudly. And this is the virtue of getting indulged into literary criticism. That's enough for today.